The night of September 6, 1941, central France, Indre region. A 53-acre farm field near the village of Tendu lay silent under a moonless sky. Auguste Chantraine stood alone in the darkness, clutching a single flashlight, listening for the distant drone of aircraft engines that would either deliver hope or bring the Gestapo to his door. The field belonged to him. The cherry orchard at its edge had been planted by his grandfather. The stone farmhouse 200 meters away sheltered his wife Lucy and their 6 children, the youngest barely 2 years old. Everything he had built over 5 decades, his land, his family, his position as mayor of this small commune, now balanced on what would happen in the next 30 minutes. From London, the British Special Operations Executive had sent word through coded radio transmission. 6 trained agents would parachute into occupied France tonight. They needed a reception committee. They needed a farmer who understood that agriculture could become warfare, that an open field could serve as Britain's first beachhead in the secret war against Nazi Germany. Chantraine had been mayor until 3 months ago, when Vichy authorities dismissed him for manifesting hostility to the work of national renovation. The official letter cited his refusal to collaborate, his socialist politics, his dangerous habit of helping refugees fleeing south during the chaos of June 1940. What the letter didn't mention was that Chantraine had already made his choice. In May, when resistance organizers Max Hymans and Georges Béguier approached him about using his land for clandestine operations, he hadn't hesitated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were brutal. The Vichy government offered 10,000 francs for information leading to the arrest of resistance members. For a struggling farmer in occupied France, that represented 6 months of income. One anonymous phone call to the authorities, and Chantraine could have collected the bounty, eliminated the risk, protected his family from the consequences of treason. But the former mayor understood something that transcended personal safety. The German occupation had transformed France into a nation of collaborators and bystanders. Someone had to resist. Someone had to provide the physical ground, literal French soil, where Britain could begin organizing the networks that might eventually liberate his country. His cherry orchard and wheat fields, unremarkable parcels of agricultural land in central France, could become strategic assets more valuable than factories or fortress. The sound reached him first as a barely perceptible vibration, then as a growing mechanical rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Chantraine raised his flashlight and flashed the agreed-upon signal 3 short bursts. 2 long, 3 short again. Morse code for the letter V. Victory. The Whitley bomber appeared as a darker shadow against the dark sky, flying at perhaps 500 feet, low enough that Chantraine could hear the wind screaming past its fuselage. 6 men would jump from that aircraft in the next 60 seconds. 6 British-trained agents carrying false papers, wireless radios, and instructions to build resistance networks across Nazi-occupied territory. The first parachute blossomed white against the darkness, then another, then 4 more in rapid succession, drifting toward the reception field like dandelion seeds on night wind. Chantraine watched them descend, calculating landing points, already moving toward where the first agent would touch down. Benjamin Cowburn hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up reaching for the quick release on his parachute harness. The British agent saw Chantraine approaching and recognized him from photographs shown during briefings in London. The farmer's weathered face and work-roughened hands marked him as exactly what he claimed to be a man of the soil who had somehow become essential to Britain's covert war. Michael Trotobas landed next, followed by Victor Gerson, Georges Langelan, Jean Dupuis, and André Bloch. 6 agents on French soil, met by 1 farmer and 2 resistance organizers who had materialized from the shadows. No German patrols, no betrayal, no Gestapo vehicles racing down the dirt road from Tendu. The operation that night represented something unprecedented in the secret war. The British Special Operations Executive had been created just 15 months earlier with Winston Churchill's famous directive to set Europe ablaze. But actually, infiltrating agents into occupied France required more than parachutes and training. It required Frenchmen like Auguste Chantraine, willing to transform their private property into forward operating bases for a foreign intelligence service. The agents gathered their fast device, equipment, while Chantraine and his brother Ernest worked to conceal the parachutes. Standard procedure called for burying the silk canopies immediately, eliminating evidence that would bring German investigators to the area. But the September ground was hard, and dawn would arrive in 4 hours. The parachutes went into a hay wagon, covered with agricultural equipment, indistinguishable from the normal detritus of farm operations. Georges Béguier, the first SOE wireless operator deployed to France, had been living in the Châteauroux region for 3 months, maintaining radio contact with London while avoiding French police and German counterintelligence. The arrival of 6 additional agents represented a massive expansion of resistance capabilities, but it also multiplied the risks. More operatives meant more chances for arrest, more opportunities for betrayal, more ways the entire network could collapse. Chantraine led the group toward his farmhouse, moving along hedgerows and irrigation ditches that provided cover from any observers. The farm at Les Cerisiers. The cherry tree had existed for generations. His family had worked this land through wars and revolutions, through the Franco-Prussian conflict and the Great War. Now it would serve as headquarters for Britain's attempt to organize French resistance from within. The farmhouse kitchen became an impromptu operations center. Lucy Chantraine, a mechanic by trade and mother of 6, prepared hot soup while her husband discussed logistics with the newly arrived agents. The British had provided false identity papers, ration cards, and enough French currency to sustain operations for several months. But the real work would require local knowledge, understanding which officials could be bribed, which police could be trusted, which roads the Germans patrolled most heavily. Cowburn spoke fluent French and had spent years working in France before the war. His mission focused on identifying targets for industrial sabotage, particularly oil and fuel storage facilities that supplied German military operations. The intelligence he gathered would guide RAF bombing campaigns and resistance attacks designed to cripple Nazi logistics. Trotobas, half French and equally fluent, would assess potential for organizing resistance networks in northern industrial regions. His background in military operations and his pre-war connections in Lille made him ideal for recruiting resistance fighters who could conduct sustained sabotage campaigns against German infrastructure. The immediate challenge involved dispersing the agents before dawn. German security forces in occupied France had become increasingly sophisticated in tracking resistance activity. Any unusual gathering of strangers would attract attention. Local police reported regularly to Vichy authorities, who shared information with German counterintelligence. The agents needed separate safe houses, cover stories that would withstand scrutiny, and contact procedures that wouldn't expose the entire network if one member was arrested. Chantraine had spent the previous weeks identifying farmers and business owners who might shelter British agents. The recruiting process required extraordinary caution. One miscalculation approaching someone loyal to Vichy or the Germans could result in immediate arrest and execution. But the former mayor's political work had built relationships across the region. He knew who had lost family members to German aggression, who harbored quiet fury at the occupation, who might be persuaded that resistance was both possible and necessary. The September night operation marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat 7 times over the next 2 years. Chantraine's fields at Les Cerisiers would become the primary reception point for SOE parachute drops in the Indre region. British aircraft would arrive in darkness, agents and supplies would descend by parachute, and the farmer who had once presided over village council meetings would organize the reception, concealment, and distribution of weapons, explosives, and personnel. The weapons arrived in subsequent drops: British Sten guns, plastic explosives, detonators, ammunition. Chantraine and his brother dispersed the material across multiple locations, hiding rifles in hay bales, burying explosive charges in fields marked only by memorized coordinates, storing detonators in false bottom grain bins that German inspectors might search but would never discover. The agricultural cover was perfect. Farmers worked at odd hours, rose before dawn, stayed in fields after dark. A man carrying a shovel at midnight wasn't suspicious he was attending to irrigation or checking livestock. A wagon loaded with hay could conceal enough weapons to equip a resistance cell. A cooperative's grain silo could store explosives more securely than any purpose-built arsenal. But the risks escalated with every operation. By October 1941, German intelligence had begun tracking increased resistance activity in central France. Vichy police received orders to investigate suspicious behaviour, monitor strangers, report any indication of British infiltration. The occupation authorities understood that effective resistance required local support, farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, willing to provide food, shelter, transportation. The penalty for harbouring British agents was explicit: immediate execution. The Germans had posted notices throughout occupied France, warning that anyone assisting enemy operatives would be shot. Entire villages could face reprisal if residents were discovered supporting resistance operations. The massacres at Oradour, Sur, Glaine and other locations would eventually demonstrate that German threats were not rhetorical. Chantraine continued anyway. Through autumn 1941 and into winter, his farm served as operational headquarters for expanding SOE networks. Benjamin Coburn returned to Britain via Spain in March 1942, carrying intelligence on German fuel installations. He parachuted back into France on the night of June 1-2, landing again in fields near Tendu, met again by Auguste Chantraine. The second mission brought weapons and explosives prepared by SOE technicians in London. Coburn and Chantraine organised distribution to resistance groups forming across the region. The equipment enabled sabotage operations that had previously existed only as theoretical plans. Power lines from the hydroelectric plant at Éguzon were cut, disrupting electricity supplies to German facilities. Machine tools at the Bloch aircraft factory in Châteauroux were tampered with, introducing defects that would compromise quality control and delay production. The resistance cells operated on principles of compartmentalization. Individual members knew only their immediate contacts, never the full network structure. If arrested and tortured, they could betray, perhaps 3 or 4 people, not the entire organization. This security architecture meant that even Chantraine didn't know all the resistance fighters his operations were supporting. He provided the ground, literally and figuratively, where others built their campaigns. Meanwhile, Michael Trotobas had been arrested in October 1941, swept up with 9 other agents, when German counterintelligence broke the network he was attempting to establish. He spent months in Mauzac internment camp, before participating in a mass prison escape in July 1942. The breakout succeeded largely because SOE operatives outside the prison provided assistance, demonstrating the value of maintaining networks capable of rescuing captured agents. Trotobas returned to England, was retrained, and parachuted back into France in November 1942. This time his target was Lille, the heavily industrialized region of northern France where German forces relied on railway networks and manufacturing facilities to support military operations. The mission required building an entirely new resistance cell from local recruits, men willing to risk execution for the opportunity to strike back at the occupation. The network Trotobas created became known as Farmer, a deliberate reference to the agricultural foundations of resistance work. The name honoured men like Auguste Chantraine, whose willingness to transform peaceful farmland into covert battlegrounds made all subsequent operations possible. Without farmers providing fields for parachute drops, barns for weapons storage, and cover for agent movements, the British secret war in France would have remained theoretical. By early 1943, the Farmer network was conducting 15 to 20 train derailments per week along the Lens-Bethune railway line. Each derailment disrupted German logistics, delayed military shipments, forced enemy resources into repair operations rather than frontline deployment. The attacks were carefully calibrated, damaging enough to create significant problems, but not so catastrophic that German reprisals would target civilian populations. Trotobas operated from Lille with a core group of approximately 20 trusted resistance fighters, though some estimates placed the network's full membership at nearly 100. The recruitment process emphasized men from what Trotobas described as undesirable elements, dock workers, small-time criminals, men whose rough backgrounds made them unlikely to appear in Gestapo intelligence files as potential resistance leaders. The strategy proved remarkably effective. German counterintelligence expected resistance organizers to recruit from educated, politically active populations. They monitored university students, known socialists, former military officers. They didn't expect resistance cells built from bar regulars and gambling den habitués. Trotobas exploited this blind spot, using his charisma and SOE-provided cash to assemble a network that operated successfully for over a year. Back in Tendu, Auguste Chantraine continued managing parachute receptions and weapons distribution. His farm had become a crucial node in SOE's supply network. British aircraft flew missions specifically to drop equipment at Le Cerisier, knowing that Chantraine would ensure proper reception and distribution. The trust placed in one French farmer represented an extraordinary gamble by British intelligence, but the gamble was paying off. The weapons and explosives that landed in Chantraine's fields were enabling resistance operations across multiple regions. Sten guns allowed Maquis fighters to ambush German patrols. Plastic explosives destroyed railway bridges and communications infrastructure. Detonators provided the technology needed to conduct precisely timed sabotage that maximized damage while minimizing civilian casualties. But success attracted attention. German counterintelligence had begun mapping resistance networks with increasing sophistication. The Gestapo understood that major operations required coordination, supply lines, and central organizers. They looked for patterns repeated parachute drops in specific areas, clusters of sabotage incidents that suggested organizational connections, individuals whose activities didn't match their cover identities. The investigation methods were brutal. Arrested resistance members faced systematic torture designed to extract information about network structures, safe houses, contact procedures. The Gestapo made no distinction between combatants and support personnel. A farmer who provided a field for parachute drops faced the same treatment as an agent who conducted sabotage operations. Chantraine knew the risks. He had hidden his political activities from Vichy authorities but understood that German intelligence was far more capable. Every parachute drop increased the probability of detection. Every week of operation brought him closer to arrest. The question wasn't whether the Gestapo would eventually identify him, but whether he could contribute enough to the resistance effort before that happened. The intelligence war in occupied France operated on principles that would have seemed absurd to conventional military planners. A single farmer with local knowledge was worth more than a battalion of infantry. A field suitable for parachute drops provided capabilities that entire air bases couldn't match. The ability to hide weapons in hay bales created logistical advantages that sophisticated supply chains couldn't replicate. Auguste Chantraine embodied this paradox. He possessed no military training, no background in intelligence operations, no experience with clandestine warfare. His expertise involved crop rotation, livestock management, and the seasonal rhythms of agricultural production. Yet these mundane skills translated directly into resistance capabilities that the British Special Operations Executive desperately needed. The Germans controlled the roads, the railways, the official communication networks. They monitored hotels, restaurants, public transportation. Their counterintelligence services tracked suspicious individuals through identity checks, travel permits, ration card distributions. The occupation authorities had transformed France into a surveillance state, where strangers attracted immediate attention and unusual behavior triggered investigation. But they couldn't monitor every farm. France contained hundreds of thousands of agricultural properties, scattered across rural landscapes that German forces lacked the manpower to patrol systematically. A farmer moving through his own fields at midnight wasn't suspicious he was working. A barn filled with equipment wasn't evidence of resistance activity, it was normal agricultural infrastructure. Chantraine exploited this operational reality with increasing sophistication. By mid-1942, he had developed procedures for parachute receptions that minimized detection risks. The flashlight signals that guided British aircraft were visible for only seconds, too brief for German observers to triangulate locations. The landing zones were positioned to provide natural concealment tree lines that blocked sight lines from roads, terrain features that prevented observation from nearby villages. The distribution network he built operated on similar principles. Weapons moved through the countryside hidden in legitimate agricultural transport. A wagon carrying hay to market might also carry Sten guns buried beneath the bales. A truck delivering grain to a cooperative could transport explosives concealed in false bottom containers. The German checkpoints that stopped and searched vehicles found only what appeared to be normal farm commerce, but the expansion of resistance activity created cascading risks. Each new agent required safe houses, cover identities, and contact procedures. Each additional weapons cache represented another location that could be discovered. Each sabotage operation generated German investigations that might trace back to the supply networks that made the attacks possible. The Vichy government collaborated enthusiastically with German efforts to suppress resistance. French police conducted raids, operated interrogation facilities, and provided intelligence to Nazi counterintelligence services. The Milice, a paramilitary organization created in early 1943, specialized in hunting resistance members, with a brutality that often exceeded German methods. These French collaborators understood local populations in ways that German officers couldn't match. They recognized faces, detected inconsistencies in cover stories, identified relationships that shouldn't exist. An unfamiliar face in a small village would prompt questions from Vichy police long before German forces noticed anything unusual. Chantraine navigated this environment through a combination of caution and audacity. He maintained his public identity as a farmer, attending to agricultural work with the same dedication he had shown before the war. Neighbors saw him ploughing fields, tending livestock, managing the normal operations that sustained rural life in occupied France. What they didn't see were the midnight parachute receptions, the weapons buried in his fields, the coded radio messages that coordinated with London. The double life required extraordinary discipline. A single mistake, a careless comment, an unusual visitor noticed by neighbors, farm work neglected because of resistance activities could trigger investigation. German intelligence trained collaborators to watch for exactly these kinds of inconsistencies. The Gestapo understood that resistance members often revealed themselves through small deviations from normal behavior. In June 1943, Michael Trotobas traveled to Paris for a meeting with the Prosper Network, one of SOE's largest resistance organizations in northern France. The meeting nearly ended in disaster. German counterintelligence arrested Prosper's leadership, including André Borel, Francis Soutil, and Gilbert Norman, during a coordinated raid that demonstrated how thoroughly the Gestapo had penetrated resistance networks. Trotobas escaped capture by minutes, warned by a contact who spotted German security forces positioning for the raid. The close call highlighted vulnerabilities that affected all resistance operations. The Prosper network had grown large enough to conduct significant operations, but size meant complexity, and complexity created opportunities for infiltration. The Germans employed sophisticated techniques to compromise resistance organizations. They captured wireless operators and forced them to continue transmitting, using threats against families to ensure cooperation. They arrested low-level members and offered freedom in exchange for betraying leadership. They planted informants who posed as resistance sympathizers while reporting to the Gestapo. Back in the Indre region, Chantraine watched these developments with growing concern. The networks he supported were expanding, conducting more ambitious operations, achieving results that attracted both British approval and German attention. The escalation was necessary. Resistance had to hurt the occupation badly enough to justify the risks. But every success increased the probability that counterintelligence would eventually trace operations back to their sources. The mathematics of resistance created a grim calculus. Each agent parachuted into France had perhaps a 50% chance of survival. Each resistance cell faced probable penetration within months of formation. Each major operation generated investigations that claimed dozens of arrests. The strategic question wasn't whether resistance members would be captured, but whether they could accomplish enough before capture to justify the casualties. Chantrain's farm had become central to this brutal equation. The 7 parachute drops, conducted at Le Cerisier between September 1941 and late 1943, had delivered dozens of agents and tons of equipment. Those resources enabled operations across central France, sabotage missions that destroyed German infrastructure, intelligence gathering that informed Allied military planning, escape networks that rescued downed airmen. But the pattern of activity had created exactly the kind of signature that German counterintelligence looked for. Multiple parachute drops in the same region suggested organized reception committees. The concentration of sabotage incidents around Châteauroux indicated coordination. The efficiency of weapons distribution implied systematic supply networks with central organizers. The investigation intensified throughout autumn 1943. German security forces conducted sweeps through rural areas, searching farms for hidden weapons, interrogating farmers about suspicious activities, mapping relationships that might indicate resistance connections. Vichy police provided detailed knowledge of local populations, identifying individuals whose politics or behavior suggested potential resistance sympathies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Auguste Chantrain understood that discovery was becoming inevitable. The question was timing. Could he continue operations long enough to make a decisive contribution? Should he reduce activity to decrease detection risks? Or should he maintain operational tempo, accepting that arrest was simply the price of effective resistance? He chose to continue. Through November and into December 1943, the farm at Le Cerisier remained active in SOE operations. Weapons moved through Chantrain's distribution network to resistance, fighters across the region. Intelligence flowed back through contact chains that connected rural France to London headquarters. The agricultural landscape that Germans viewed as passive territory was actually hostile ground, where farmers fought with information, logistics, and carefully concealed weapons. The end came on December 27, 1943. German security forces, supported by Vichy police, raided the farm at Le Cerisier based on intelligence developed through months of investigation. They arrested Auguste Chantrain in his farmhouse, surrounded by the normal artifacts of agricultural life that had provided cover for 2 years of resistance activity. The arrest was not random. German counterintelligence had compiled evidence linking Chantrain to parachute receptions, weapons distribution, and contacts with known SOE agents. The investigation had mapped his network systematically, identifying participants, documenting operations, building a case that left little room for denial. Chantrain was transferred to Vichy custody, then moved through a series of detention facilities as French and German authorities coordinated prosecution. The charges were explicit: organizing resistance activity, providing material support to enemy forces, facilitating British intelligence operations on French soil. Each charge carried a death sentence under occupation law. But execution wasn't immediate. The Germans wanted information more than they wanted one farmer's death. Chantrain underwent interrogation, designed to extract details about resistance networks, names of other participants, locations of weapons, caches, procedures for contacting London. The techniques employed were systematically brutal, refined through years of crushing resistance movements across occupied Europe. The former mayor revealed nothing. Despite interrogation that lasted weeks, he provided no information that would compromise other resistance members. The discipline was extraordinary. Most prisoners broke under torture, offering fragments of intelligence that interrogators could piece together into actionable information. Chantrain remained silent, protecting the networks he had helped build. By late January 1944, German authorities concluded that further interrogation would yield no useful intelligence. Chantrain was sentenced to deportation to Germany, transferred to the ISIS detention center at Villeneuve-sur-Lot, where political prisoners awaited transport to concentration camps. The prison housed approximately 1,200 resistance members, communists, and others deemed enemies of the occupation. The conditions at ISIS were deliberately harsh. Prisoners received minimal food, no medical care, and faced random violence from guards who understood that these inmates were destined for camps where most would die. The psychological pressure was intense, knowing that deportation to Germany meant almost certain death in facilities like Dachau or Mauthausen. On May 30, 1944, German authorities loaded 1,200 prisoners from ISIS onto trains bound for concentration camps. The timing was significant. Allied forces had landed in Normandy just 24 days earlier. The liberation of France had begun, but it would come too late for the men in those railway cars. Auguste Chantraine arrived at Dachau concentration camp, bearing prisoner number 73,255. The numerical designation replaced his identity, no longer a farmer, no longer a mayor, simply another body in a system designed to extract labor until death. The camp administration registered him as a political prisoner, classification that marked him for particularly brutal treatment. From Dachau, he was transferred to Gusen, a subcamp of the Mauthausen complex in Austria. Gusen specialized in working prisoners to death through forced labor in stone quarries and underground armaments factories. The average survival time for new arrivals was measured in months, sometimes weeks. Prisoners received starvation rations, endured constant beatings, and died from exhaustion, disease, or random execution. The camp records list no specific cause of death. The bureaucratic notation simply marks his prisoner number as deceased. He was 48 years old, 8 weeks away from the camp's liberation by American forces. The irony was crushing. The farmer who had provided the ground where British intelligence launched operations into occupied France died in a concentration camp while Allied armies advanced toward final victory. He wouldn't see France liberated, wouldn't know that the networks he supported had contributed to Germany's defeat, wouldn't receive recognition for transforming agricultural land into strategic assets that challenged Nazi control. Meanwhile, in northern France, Michael Trotobas had continued operations with the farmer network through most of 1943. The railway sabotage campaign he directed had destroyed hundreds of German freight cars, delayed military shipments, and forced occupation authorities to divert resources into security operations rather than frontline deployment. The attacks demonstrated that resistance could achieve significant tactical effects, even against an occupier with overwhelming military superiority. But Trotobas's success attracted the same intensive investigation that had compromised Chantrain's network. German counterintelligence infiltrated the farmer organization, identified key members, and planned coordinated arrests. On November 28, 1943, just 1 month before Chantrain's arrest, the Gestapo raided the Lille apartment where Trotobas was staying. The raid turned into a firefight. Trotobas, armed with a pistol, engaged German security forces rather than surrender. The exchange lasted several minutes, with Trotobas firing from defensive positions inside the apartment while Gestapo agents advanced through the building. The British agent died in the gunfight, shot multiple times, killed rather than captured. The simultaneity was not coincidence. German counterintelligence had achieved a sophisticated understanding of SOE operations in France by late 1943. They could map connections between agents, trace supply networks back to their sources, identify farmers and civilians who provided critical support. The arrests of Chantrain and the death of Trotobas reflected coordinated German operations designed to dismantle resistance infrastructure systematically. But the networks survived. The compartmentalized structure that SOE had implemented meant that arresting one cell didn't compromise the entire organization. New agents parachuted into France, found new farmers willing to provide reception fields, built new resistance cells to replace those that German security had destroyed. Benjamin Coburn, who had landed in Chantrain's field on that September night in 1941, continued operations throughout the war. He survived multiple missions, conducted numerous sabotage operations, and returned to Britain after France's liberation. His memoir would document the critical role that farmers like Chantraine played in making resistance operations possible. The strategic impact extended far beyond individual operations. The intelligence gathered by resistance networks informed Allied military planning for D-Day and subsequent campaigns. The sabotage conducted by groups like Farmers' Network degraded German logistics and forced the occupation to divert resources into security operations. The escape networks that farmers supported helped dozens of downed Allied airmen return to Britain, preserving trained personnel who would fly additional combat missions. The economic cost to Germany was substantial. Every train derailment required repair crews and replacement equipment. Every power line sabotaged reduced industrial production. Every German soldier assigned to guard railway infrastructure was a soldier unavailable for frontline combat. The resistance didn't liberate France through force of arms, but it made the occupation expensive and difficult in ways that conventional military operations couldn't achieve. Auguste Chantraine's contribution to these outcomes was foundational but largely invisible. He never conducted dramatic sabotage operations, never engaged in armed combat, never achieved the kind of heroic moment that generates medals and recognition. His resistance consisted of providing ground literal earth where others could build campaigns against the occupation. The field at Le Cerissier, where he stood with a flashlight on September 6, 1941, became a strategic asset more valuable than many military installations. The parachute drops conducted there delivered capabilities that changed the calculus of resistance operations. The weapons he distributed enabled attacks across multiple regions. The agents he sheltered went on to organize networks that involved thousands of resistance fighters. But the official recognition came decades too late and marked with bureaucratic efficiency that couldn't capture the human cost. On March 11, 1947, 2 years after his death, Auguste Chantraine was posthumously awarded the Médaille de la Résistance. On May 24, 1947, he was promoted posthumously to the rank of captain. The French government recognized him as a member of the Forces Françaises Combattantes and the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. His name appears on the monument to the dead in Tendu. A memorial plaque was erected in 2003 at the lieu dit Le Cerissier, the cherry tree, 1,100 meters from the departmental road, marking the spot where British agents first parachuted onto French soil with farmer reception. The inscription honors the commitment of Auguste Chantraine to operations that helped liberate France. The simplicity of the memorial reflects the nature of his contribution. No dramatic battle scene, no heroic last stand. Just acknowledgement that a farmer provided his land, his courage, and ultimately his life to resistance operations that conventional military forces couldn't conduct. Lucy Chantraine, the mechanic who had prepared soup for British agents in her kitchen, raised their 6 children alone after her husband's deportation and death. The youngest was only 4 years old when Auguste was arrested. They would grow up knowing their father had been a resistance hero, but without memory of the man who had transformed cherry orchards into battlegrounds. The farm at Le Cerissier continued operating after the war, returned to ordinary agricultural production that bore no visible trace of its wartime role. The fields where agents parachuted became wheat fields again. The barn that stored weapons housed tractors and hay. The landscape returned to peaceful anonymity, unremarkable rural terrain, indistinguishable from thousands of other French farms. But the strategic principle that Auguste Chantraine had demonstrated remained relevant long after 1945. The ability of ordinary civilians to challenge powerful occupiers through systematic non-compliance and covert action would influence resistance movements for generations. The techniques developed by SOE and the French resistance compartmentalized networks, local civilian support, agricultural cover for military operations became templates studied by intelligence services worldwide. The Cold War would see these methods adapted to different conflicts. The techniques for organizing clandestine networks, managing covert supply chains, and coordinating between civilian resistance and external military support would reappear in resistance movements from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. The fundamental insight remained constant. Control of territory requires more than military occupation. Without civilian cooperation, Even powerful armies face endless complications from populations that resist through information, logistics, and carefully concealed opposition. Auguste Chantraine never knew that his methods would influence global military doctrine. He approached resistance as a practical problem, requiring agricultural solutions. He had land suitable for parachute drops, so he provided it. He had barns for storing weapons, so he used them. He understood local terrain better than German occupiers, so he exploited that advantage. The sophistication emerged from necessity rather than training, improvised by a farmer who understood that his cherry orchard had become strategically valuable to forces trying to liberate his country. The final irony was temporal. Chantraine died in March 1945, just 8 weeks before American forces liberated Gusen concentration camp. He survived nearly 16 months of detention, interrogation, and forced labor, enduring conditions designed to kill prisoners through systematic brutality. He came within weeks of liberation, close enough that prisoners in adjacent camps would soon walk free while he lay dead from the accumulated damage of starvation and abuse. His brother Ernest, who had assisted with resistance operations at Le Cerissier, survived the war and continued farming the land that had served as Britain's covert staging ground. Ernest could look across the fields where agents had parachuted and know that his brother's sacrifice had contributed to the liberation they now enjoyed. But the knowledge didn't diminish the loss, didn't restore the man who had chosen resistance over safety, who had valued French freedom more than personal survival. The strategic deception that farmers like Chantraine enabled operated on principles that conventional military planners initially dismissed as insignificant. What difference could agricultural workers make against mechanized German forces? How could fields and barns challenge an occupation supported by tanks and artillery? The questions reflected assumptions that resistance would require military-style confrontation, armed battles that farmers couldn't win. But resistance warfare operated on different principles. The Germans couldn't bomb what they couldn't find. They couldn't arrest people whose resistance activities remained invisible. They couldn't prevent sabotage conducted by civilians who appeared to be engaged in normal economic activity. The occupation's strength military superiority became irrelevant against opposition that avoided direct confrontation while systematically degrading logistics and intelligence. Auguste Chantraine understood this intuitively. He didn't attempt to fight German soldiers. He provided the infrastructure that allowed trained agents to conduct operations beyond German capability to prevent. His cherry orchard didn't defeat Nazi military power through force. It defeated Nazi intelligence services through deception, hiding covert military operations within a landscape that appeared entirely civilian. The liberation of France in 1944 and 45 validated the strategy. Allied military forces provided the conventional strength necessary to defeat German armies. But the invasion succeeded partly because resistance networks had degraded German logistics, provided intelligence on defensive positions, and forced occupation authorities to divert resources into security operations. The farmers who had hidden weapons in hay bales and received agents in midnight parachute drops had contributed capabilities that conventional forces couldn't replicate. The price, measured in lives like Auguste Chantraine's, was substantial. Thousands of resistance members died in concentration camps, executed by firing squad, or killed during operations. Their deaths didn't achieve the kind of tactical victory that conventional military campaigns measure in territory captured or enemy forces destroyed. But they created conditions that made conventional victory possible, providing intelligence, logistics, and systematic resistance that complicated every aspect of German occupation. The memorialization came slowly. France spent decades processing the complex legacy of occupation. The collaboration that had kept Vichy functioning, the resistance that had opposed German control, the liberation that had restored sovereignty but couldn't restore the dead. Auguste Chantraine's name on a monument in Tendu represented official recognition, but it couldn't capture the terror of standing in dark fields waiting for British aircraft, the discipline required to endure interrogation without betraying other resistance members, or the despair of dying in a concentration camp weeks before liberation. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The farm at Les Cerisiers stands now as private property, worked by families who may not know its wartime history. The memorial plaque marks the location, but the landscape itself shows no evidence of the operations conducted there. Crops grow in fields where agents parachute. Farm equipment occupies barns that once stored British weapons. The cherry trees that gave the property its name continue their seasonal cycles, indifferent to the history that unfolded beneath their branches. But the legacy persists in understanding how ordinary people challenge extraordinary power. Auguste Chantraine wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained in warfare, and possessed no special skills beyond farming and local politics. Yet his contribution to defeating Nazi Germany was strategic, foundational, and ultimately fatal. The cherry orchard that seemed militarily irrelevant became one of the most important pieces of ground in the secret war, not because of any inherent tactical value, but because a farmer decided his land would serve liberation rather than occupation. That choice, replicated by farmers across occupied France, transformed the strategic equation. The Germans could occupy cities, control roads, monitor official institutions, but they couldn't occupy every farm, couldn't search every barn, couldn't prevent farmers from turning agricultural landscape into resistance infrastructure. The scope of their failure became apparent only after liberation, when the full extent of resistance networks finally emerged into historical record. Auguste Chantraine's story represents thousands of similar narratives: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mechanics who chose resistance despite overwhelming risks. Most died anonymously, their contributions known only to immediate resistance contacts, who often died themselves before recording what they knew. The historical record captures fragments: official reports, scattered memoirs, German security files documenting arrests. But the complete story remained hidden in fields, where parachutes descended in darkness, barns, where weapons lay concealed beneath agricultural equipment, and kitchens where farmers fed British agents while planning operations that would help liberate France. The invisibility was intentional, necessary for survival. It also meant that recognition, when it finally came, could never adequately acknowledge what had been risked and lost. The farmer who stood in his field on September 6, 1941, watching British agents descend by parachute, made a choice that would eventually kill him. He knew the risks: the Vichy bounty for information, the German threats of execution, the systematic brutality of occupation, justice, all of it was explicit and immediate. But he also knew that resistance required ground, required farmers willing to transform peaceful agricultural land into covert military infrastructure. His cherry orchard became Britain's secret weapon, not through any exotic technology or sophisticated tactics, but through the simple courage of a man who decided that his land, his family's heritage, and ultimately his life were worth sacrificing for the possibility that France might someday be free. The Germans never understood this kind of calculation. They could offer bounties, threaten reprisals, deploy security forces. But they couldn't prevent the fundamental choice that Auguste Chantraine and thousands like him made to resist rather than submit, to fight with whatever tools agricultural life provided, and to accept whatever consequences followed. The cherry trees at Les Cerisiers bloom each spring, marking seasons that Auguste Chantraine will never see. The fields he worked produce crops he'll never harvest. The village of Tendu, where he served as mayor until Vichy dismissed him for refusing collaboration, continues its quiet existence in rural France. Nothing about the landscape suggests its wartime significance. But history remembers, preserved in memorials and documents and stories passed through generations who understand that liberation was built on sacrifices that can be honored but never fully repaid.